Hello, everyone. My name is Peter Taylor. I'm Director of Research at the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex in the UK. And I'm really delighted to welcome you all to this session along with my fellow co-chair, Crystal Tremblay of the University of Victoria. We acknowledge with respect the Lekwungen people on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. And many of us are meeting in this virtual space from locations outside of Victoria and across the world. So I'd also like to acknowledge the lands on which you live and work. First, a few housekeeping notes. Please note the session is being recorded. Once you have been admitted to the meeting, microphones will be muted, and we just ask you to keep your microphones muted unless you're speaking. We'd like you to keep your cameras on, if at all possible, because it's really great to see everybody. If the connection starts to drop, then we may ask you to turn them off, but at the moment, it's looking good. We are able to have comments and questions in the chat function, and please do, when the time comes, we're really looking forward to getting your comments and to hearing things that you have to say. And also, if you could change your display name to your actual name, hopefully you know how to do that. There's a little dots beside your name in the box in which you can see yourself. That will help when it comes to assigning us all to the breakout rooms. Okay, as you're aware, in the Victoria Forum, this session is entitled Bridging Social Divides, Decolonising Knowledge for Transformation. And we've heard a lot about social divides already in this virtual Victoria Forum, including earlier today in the previous session, which some of us have just been involved in. And we've been hearing that the pandemic, COVID-19, has had its greatest impact where social divides are greatest. It's affecting those who are most vulnerable, most marginalised, and most disempowered. And in turn, many of the measures intended to address the pandemic are actually having an even greater impact on those who are already left out and those who are not included. So why, when there are so many pressing challenges, did we want to have this particular conversation today about decolonising knowledge for transformation? And Crystal and I and many others we've engaged with felt we simply could not avoid having this conversation, regardless of the backdrop of a pandemic. So many of the structural divides, the barriers, the constraints, the foundational cracks in our society that we observe today are a product of colonial pasts. And more people all over the world are falling through these widening foundational cracks. This year we've seen powerful evidence of the legacy of colonial power, calls for urgent action by the Me Too and Black Lives Matter movements. We also see the catalysing influence of the Sustainable Development Goals. So to move forward, we need to work hard through these movements and with others to understand these social divides and also to act in ways that help to break them down. And as we said in the background note to the session, we are seeing a positive shift away from thinking about development as something which affects others. And we're thinking about it now much more as a universal agenda that affects us all. But even with a gradual move towards a universal agenda and many efforts to decolonize development, we also see that its related bodies of knowledge are still mired in capitalist, colonial, and unequal hierarchies and power structures. And we see so many inequities and inequalities still widespread today that are produced by racial, class, gender, sexual, religious, linguistic, and also ecological power hierarchies. And they're produced and reproduced by power relations that underpin the very nature of knowledge and how it's created. We're still asking today, in fact, whose knowledge counts. So in today's session, we want to call into question the principles that sustain the current dominant knowledge and understanding of what society should be like. We'd like to think about the norms and the structures that often determine how people should behave, what kind of knowledge is valued, which knowledge is encouraged, silenced, or simply not supported at all. And we see this as a global challenge and that these are divides that are experienced everywhere in the world. Now, in this roundtable, we're very fortunate to have with us a diverse group of participants to help us focus on the strengths, resilience, and wise practices within communities. And diversity is critical because decolonizing knowledge and knowledge production in all its forms needs to include and be driven by the people whose lives are most affected by the decisions and policies being made. As one of our speakers in our roundtable on youth said yesterday, what you do for us is without us. So today we want to engage with the lived experience of all those who are present in this session. And to help us do that, Crystal and I are thrilled to have three incredible panelists. Catherine Toure serves as Regional Director in Eastern and Southern Africa for Canada's International Development Research Centre, IDRC, based in Nairobi. Her commitments to social justice, women's empowerment, respect for the environment, inclusive design, community inquiry, and shifting narratives have been part of her work with youth, elders, educators, researchers, refugees, and policymakers. Catherine is passionate about lifelong learning and promotes learning across multiple boundaries. Her recent publications, often in collaboration with colleagues, use sociocultural and historical lenses to share perspectives and lived experiences across generations. We also have Martha Mutisi, who's a Senior Program Officer with IDRC's Governance and Justice Program. Also based in Nairobi, Martha oversees research projects in the region, focusing on promoting youth resilience to violence and vulnerability, promoting women's roles in peace and security, strengthening women's leadership in education and science systems, and addressing the impacts of forced migration on local governance, and among others. She's been more than 15 years of experience in research training, policy influence and program design, implementation and management in peace, security, governance, and development. And thirdly, Paul Lacerte is managing partner with Raven Indigenous Capital Partners based in British Columbia, Canada. He has provided innovative leadership to Indigenous organizations throughout his career. He's the former vice chair of the Vancouver Foundation Board of Directors, the former board chair for Reconciliation Canada, and a former representative to the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. And he was awarded the Order of BC in 2014. It's really great to have our speakers here, and also great to have so many participants as well. Welcome all. So we're going to hear first from Catherine and Martha, and then from Paul. And then after that, we're going to take a deeper dive into some of these issues in smaller breakout rooms, where each of you will have a chance to contribute to these discussions. And with Crystal, we'll provide some more details at the time. So now I'd like to invite Catherine and Martha, please, to start us off with some reflections. You're on mute, Catherine. Perfect.
Greetings from Nairobi. Karibuni. Bonjour. In 5 minutes, I'd like to cover 3 ideas. How divides are connectors, the importance of narrative and different kinds of knowledge, and how the organization I work with, IDRC, transcends boundaries. A river divides. It also connects parts of a city. A street may divide black and white neighborhoods. It can also bring people together across divides to explore commonalities and common aspirations. What, in communities of which you are a part, divides yet also unites? Apparent divisions do not preclude obvious and subtle interconnections. Media, politicians, and even academia have promoted ideas about social divides when humanity is so interconnected. Part of the work of decolonization is for knowledge workers to facilitate processes that reveal interdependencies across apparent divides. Community inquiry can make buried history and buried connections come alive in important and meaningful ways. The narratives we construct about what divides and what connects are important. And for narratives to have resonance, they often need to combine knowledge from multiple sources. Western thinking promotes dichotomies and hierarchies, for example, North and South, which have limited power to represent and explain reality. African worldviews allow for more complexity, nuance, ambiguity, and holistic thinking. Seeming opposites are not diametrically opposed. Rather, they are 2 sides of the same coin. The Nigerian novelist Ngozi Chimamanda Adichie explains the importance of narratives in a TED Talk that you may have seen titled The Danger of a Single Story. Growing up, Adichie read about blue-eyed girls who play in the snow, eat apples, and drink ginger beer. When she started writing, all her characters were white. Adichie has since decolonized her reading, her mind, and her writing. Some of you may have read her short stories and novels about Nigeria, and now youth can read about people who look like them. Adichie is among a plethora of emerging African writers telling African stories. My point is that we need to decolonize our minds if our work is to be truly transformative. This will allow us to bring our true selves forward. COVID and post-COVID worlds need the truths and confidence of all peoples. And my third point, Canada's International Development Research Centre, or IDRC, engages in important boundary-crossing work to bring people and knowledge together and promote African leadership in science. Let me mention a few examples. Vitoria Langa de Jesus, Executive Director of the National Research Fund in Mozambique in Southern Africa, explained how work with other science granting councils in Africa across national and linguistic divides builds confidence. Confidence is important. Africa is the world's most youthful continent. IDRC has the privilege of supporting a dynamic cohort of youth-led organizations from a dozen African countries, facilitating knowledge-building agendas and learning across national boundaries and generations. We also explore knowledge at the frontiers of existing fields. For example, bringing together networks of climate action specialists and networks of lawyers to explore concepts like climate justice and energy justice. Working across more and less politically stable contexts is important. That is why IDRC invested with Global Affairs Canada in Knowledge for Democracy in Myanmar to support a new generation of knowledge workers and a re-emerging knowledge system. I had a couple other examples, but I only have 6 seconds, so I would like to conclude by saying that to decolonize knowledge, we need to recognize people as knowers of their experiences and invest in interconnected local knowledge systems. We need to nourish convivial relationships characterized by humility, respect, equality, and desires to mutually learn. And with that, I'd like to hand over to my colleague, Dr. Martha Mutisi.
Thank you very much, Catherine. I'll continue with your line of thought that decolonizing knowledge is about recognizing and legitimizing the knowledge systems of multiple groups and also acknowledging disregarded epistemologies. This process requires us to unlearn what we often consider as the proper way of knowing and understanding how societies operate. It is about breaking down barriers between people. It is the recognition that there are so many knowledge systems. There is no universal knowledge which should be considered superior over other. Decolonizing knowledge is also about recognizing that in development processes, local communities, local voices, they matter. They should not just be consulted for optics, but they should be the architect of their own development trajectory, much more so even during this COVID era and in the post-pandemic recovery era. When I think of about how a country has intentionally decolonized its knowledge systems, I think about Rwanda. This is a country that has implemented a lot of homegrown solutions to its post-conflict realities. The famous Gacaca courts were used in Rwanda to try cases of genocide following the tragedy of 1994. This was after the country realized that they could not rely on the modern court system, which had actually been destroyed as a result of the genocide. So the country then intentionally sought to use its local knowledge systems, went back to its roots, and actually selected judges who were known as the Inyangamugayo, persons of integrity, who were given the huge task and mandate to try cases of genocide. But because of their integrity and because they were chosen by the communities, all people trusted them to give fair judgments. And Rwanda has continued, even after the Gacaca courts have closed, with this idea of giving reverence to local knowledge systems. they now have established what are called Abunzi mediation committees. These are committees that are at the local level, down to the village level, where small-scale disputes are actually resolved by persons of integrity, known as the Vabunzi. The Vabunzi are persons who reconcile. So instead of people spending time going to court, which is very expensive and which uses the litigation measure, Abunzi mediation system actually helps locals to engage in relationship building and in dialogue processes. IDRC's support towards the University of Dar es Salaam also revealed the importance of decolonizing knowledge, even as we are trying to support processes that promote security, youth, peace and security. In Tanzania, we found out that the concept of nyumba kumi, which are 10 households, when you literally translate that phrase, has been used not just to promote local governance, but to ensure that local people provide input to their development processes. So nyumba kumi processes have actually been very responsible for ensuring that citizens provide inputs to government actors, to development partners, to civil society actors on what they need in terms of getting going when it comes to development. In Kenya, the nyumba kumi process was also has also been borrowed through one of the IDRC projects called the Mukuru project. It is a project which sought to involve informal sector actors in the regeneration of their local area, following the recognition that they were being disadvantaged in terms of service delivery by the Nairobi city county. The Mukuru project consulted more than 5,000 people using the 10 cells, 10 households per cell. 5,000 people were consulted in terms of what they wanted to see in terms of a better Nairobi, which provided enough services, which catered to their development needs. So these are some of the examples that actually reflect that when you engage with people and treat them as the knowers and the architects of their development process, they will actually provide good feedback. They will provide ideas that can actually feed into national and local development process. So I'll stop there with those few examples and just underline that in this COVID era, it is also important to ensure that even as national governments are establishing COVID task force, those task forces are not just removed from local people. They should be intentional in including the voices of young people, the voices of women, the voices of local communities, because these are the people who live the reality of the impact of movement restrictions, of the impact of the economies closing down as a result of the pandemic. So it's very important to ensure that these spaces are opened up to allow them to shape their reality. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Martha. Great points. And I think it's particularly important that you're stressing the pivotal role of people at the community level. And in fact, that question came up in the previous session that we were involved with, the opening plenary for today, where many of the speakers were talking about government and the role of government, but they were reminded on numerous occasions that governments must respond to the needs and demands and aspirations of the people. So I think it's really important that you've raised that and brought that part in. So Paul, I'd like to turn to you, and as we can see, you're in the role of groovy speaker today, which I think is going to give us a completely different take. So over to you.
Hadi Deneza Tekes Daicho, Paul Lacert, Sadney, Mark Lacert Spa, Marilyn Slood, Nasil Dea Hatian, Sophie Ketlo Alu, Sagana Laxiliu in Jan Yenkaktene Keoch, Tabesna Chalia in Jan Lakwangan Keoch. So good day, my relatives. Good day, my respected friends. My name is Paul Lacert. My traditional name is Gilam Gilo. My mom and dad are Mark and Marilyn Lessert, and I want to say hello to my mom, who is actually attending the session today. And I also want to send out my greetings to June Halliday and Terry Monroe. I am a mixed blood Indigenous man from the Carrier First Nation in North Central British Columbia, and I'm joining you from the traditional territories of the Lekwungen speaking peoples, the Songhees and the Esquimalt First Nations. I want to thank Elder Skip Dick for the virtual welcome to the territory this morning and to give him my respect. I am grateful to be here with you today, and I want to extend my deep appreciation to the organizers of the Victoria Forum, and especially to you, Dr. Crystal Tremblay and Dr. Peter Taylor for the invitation. And thank you so much, Catherine and Martha, both of you for your compelling comments, and it's an honor to share this space with you. I wanted to share a few thoughts on the questions posed for the session, and the first being in the context of COVID-19, what is our experience of efforts to decolonize knowledge and power as a means of reducing social divides? So I'm a managing partner with Raven Indigenous Capital Partners, Canada's first Indigenous owned financial intermediary, and we have raised the first Indigenous owned impact investment fund in the world. And I can tell you that my assumption was that COVID-19 would create the conditions for decolonization and in the form of reconciliation to take a back seat once again in the name of necessity. That it would once again be seen as a nice to have rather than a must have. And I am both surprised, I would say, and pleased to share that in my experience, the process of decolonization through a lens of reconciliation has in fact become even more deeply rooted. And for Raven Capital, this looks like a significant increase in the appetite on the part of investors to invest in Indigenous peoples, and more specifically, in our case, to invest in this new space of Indigenous impact. And specifically, we've experienced investors to be willing to increase their risk tolerance. And we have found a deepened desire amongst investors to learn and grow, to challenge their own beliefs and attitudes towards Indigenous peoples, and a deepened desire to support Indigenous resurgence as a pathway to address climate change and to strengthen social cohesion. And I can say that for Indigenous peoples, certainly here in Canada and around the world, and increasing the flow of capital towards solutions in the Indigenous space as driven by our people, and that the reinvigorating of an Indigenous economy in the image of our cultures, driven by our Indigenous epistemologies, is absolutely necessary component of the pathway towards reducing social divides and increasing equity and opportunity for some of the most marginalized, systemically marginalized people in the world. The second question: what strategies, approaches, and methods for decolonization have worked well? And as mentioned, my entire lived experience related to decolonization and decolonizing knowledge has been in the Indigenous context. And this is certainly not a new conversation for Indigenous peoples here in Canada and around the world. And the foot of colonization has been on our throat for generations. So tremendous progress has been made in this area, certainly at the United Nations in the development of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which every country on the planet has now endorsed. That, as you know, was not an easy process. And in fact, in 2008, as recently as 2008, 4 countries voted against the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People: Canada, the United States, Australia, and New Zealand voted against our fundamental rights as human beings. So this journey and the progress we've made has been hard fought and hard earned. And of course, respectfully, those 4 countries have now all since endorsed the declaration. Unfortunately, you know, our own country of Canada was a conditional endorsement, the only country in the world to provide a conditional endorsement of the UN Declaration. So those 46 articles in the UN DRIP give us a roadmap for decolonizing our policies, laws, systems, and actions. And for those in the room, you know, I would ask that you familiarize yourself with those articles and create a personal or professional action plan to implement one or more of those articles as a measurable way to move through what can otherwise seem as to be an amorphous decolonization challenge and can seem a bit overwhelming, and to build towards a better future than the past that we have all had. You know, here in Canada, we also had a Truth Commission, which was called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where over 6,700 Native residential school survivors shared their truths of what happened to them through 5 generations of forced removal from their homes. And many of them, as elders, shared those stories for the first time. And that commission produced a report with 94 calls to action. And I would suggest this serves as our second roadmap, if you will, a guide for us on this journey of decolonization and reculturalization. And again, I would ask that you familiarize yourself with those 94 calls to action. And finally, you know, here in Canada, we had a national inquiry into murdered and missing Indigenous women. We have so many Indigenous women in this country as a result of colonization that have been murdered or have gone missing, that we needed a standalone inquiry to try to understand the implications of colonization and the critical urgency to decolonize our knowledge and our systems so that that lived experience is transformed and Indigenous women in this country have a you know, equally safe lived experience as women who are not Indigenous. So as a father of 4 invisibly Indigenous women, I would ask that you take the time to read through those 231 calls for justice. And again, you know, do a project or take an action that responds to one or more of those calls. And these actions can be equally effective, you know, here in Canada or abroad. So the one thing that we do not need is another study. You know, Indigenous peoples in Canada and around the world have been asked how to go on this journey of decolonization and reculturalization together. And the roadmaps and pathways have been laid out in front of us. You know, we just need to follow them. And the third question posed, what concrete steps are needed towards building back better? You know, this idea beyond the pandemic, by decolonizing the world in ways which transcend turf, welcome, and truth. And I can tell you that I'm really looking forward to seeing many of you in person next year, where we get a chance to dig into those questions in person. And I would suggest this last question is really an invitation for self-reflection. And I would suggest that systems change when people change. And I love this idea that Dr. Tremblay shared in her opening comments this morning of one hand in the stars and one hand in the soil. And for me, this is really an inside job. The space in between the hand in the stars and the hand in the soil, it's an inside job for each and every one of us, but particularly for those in positions of power and influence. And so I have a few questions to pose to you today. And the questions are, am I okay? Am I actually okay with the status quo? How am I part of the problem? And I think as we all have to reach for our higher selves, these are questions that every single one of us are being called to answer. How am I part of the problem? How am I currently benefiting from the systems of colonization and from the current social divide? What am I prepared to give up in order to bring about real and lasting change? And finally, am I prepared to get comfortable with discomfort? And I can say that I don't like discomfort. So as a white appearing, able-bodied male, I need to be uncomfortable because I have so much privilege in this world. And so that even in preparing for this session, Peter, I found myself having to sit with that last question in particular is, am I prepared to get comfortable with discomfort? And I have just one last thought. And look, as we practice decolonization every day, one way that we can do that is to share our, the beauty of our cultures and languages with each other in a good way, to build that reciprocity and to see the light in each other. And so I wanted to end by inviting everyone in this session to share in a word or in a phrase from my carrier language. I start my comments in my own Indigenous language and I finish in my own Indigenous language. And so the statement, and I'll say it a few times so you can say it and perhaps write it down, is Nian Spe Hunzu. So this is a carrier word or a carrier phrase, North Central British Columbia, Nian Spe Hunzu. And it means, you are so beautiful to me that my heart leaps up inside of me when I look at you. And we need that medicine in this world. If we're going to break down these divides, we are being fed a broken narrative that safety equals retreat to people that look and think like you. We're being fed this broken narrative. And we need to replace that narrative with, you are so beautiful to me that my heart leaps up inside of me when I look at you. Imagine if that was what we thought when we looked at each other. Yeah? Nian Spe Hunzu. So I'm going to get everybody sort of virtually. I know I can't see many of you, but I'm going to ask you to say it together on the count of three. It's Nian Spe Hunzu. On the count of three. 1, 2, 3. Nian Spe Hunzu. Nian Spe Hunzu. You are so beautiful to me that my heart leaps up inside of me when I look at you. If you're in trouble with your spouse, you could say that and it'll get you out of trouble.
Okay. Paul, Martha, Catherine, Nian Spe Hunzu. And I think you have brought us to a provocative and important point where you asked us some really searching questions, Paul, personal questions for us to reflect on. We want to take that now into the next part of the session. So rather than opening up the discussion now altogether, we're going to break out and have an opportunity to meet each other in a smaller space and to engage a little bit. And with that, I'm going to ask Crystal Tremblay, my co-lead, to help us with that. And just to say, Crystal is an assistant professor in the Department of Geography and special advisor on community engaged scholarship at the University of Victoria, and a wonderful co-host who I've been inspired to work with over the last year. So, Crystal, your help now on the next stage would be tremendous.
Thanks so much, Peter. Indeed, it's been a long journey together preparing, so it's so nice to be here and to have so many participants. And I'm just moved so much by your words, Paul, and your challenge to all of us. It's so important, and I think it is this inside job, and I just really am grateful for that. And Martha and Catherine, your examples from Africa and where you are, and the importance of the multiple knowledges, multiple worldviews in all of this work that we're doing. So I'm just so grateful to be with you in sharing this panel today. And we really wanted to have a deeper dive and engagement into these conversations, into these questions that Paul did speak to. And I've also posted in the chat room. So how we're going to do this is I've just included a link to Jamboard. So Jamboard, some of you might be familiar with. It's kind of a similar platform as Google Docs. It gives a little bit more interactivity. So I invite you all to click on the Jamboard link in the chat. Don't leave the Zoom, so you'll bring up another browser, so you can kind of, what I do is just have my Zoom screen on one side and then a browser on the other. And when you open Jamboard, you'll see a panel, and there's a number of panels in here that I've prepared with the 2 questions. And I'm going to make some breakout rooms. We have 31 participants, which is perfect and a good number. So I'll make maybe 5 breakout rooms. And in each breakout room, we'd invite you to use the Jamboard depending on the group that you're in. So if we have 5 groups, if you're group 2, then you'll just go to the slide 2. And you'll see we have a few sticky notes in there. You can make comments. Peter and I will be collecting all of these ideas and comments to put together in some proceedings. But when we come back from these smaller breakout rooms, we'll ask each of one person from each group to give just 1 to 2 kind of key points that you'd want to share. And you can speak to both questions, or if you wanted to just focus on one question in your group, I'll leave that to you. But we really envisioned this to be a space so we can all engage on this topic. So I hope that's clear, and I hope you all enjoy the smaller breakout sessions. And we will be in that breakout room for about 25 minutes, and then we'll come back and have a kind of a debrief on that. So I'm going to initiate sounds so technical, but the breakout rooms now.
Welcome back, everyone. If you're like our group, we were just literally in mid-sentence, which was a shame just to be suddenly drawn out of it, but such a stimulating conversation there. Really, really fabulous, I can say, where we were. I hope the same for you. Crystal, I'm going to ask for your help now.
Yes.
Enabling us to have a reflection on what we learned and shared together in those groups, if you wouldn't mind.
Great. Thanks, Peter. I hope everyone had a really good conversation. I know we did in our small group. So what I'll do now, and I scroll through and I see everyone's been using the Jamboard, so that makes me really happy to keep some of these ideas recorded. So what I'll do is share my screen. And we have about 23 minutes, and I think we've got 5 groups. So I thought maybe we could just go through. Can everyone see my screen okay?
Yeah.
So we could just go through each group, and would be great just to hear a couple key points. So if there's a volunteer from group 1.
You might have to say who was in which groups, Crystal.
Well, I see a Heather, but I don't see any other names on this one. Does this look familiar to anyone from this group?
Hi, Crystal, it's Heather Ranson. Yes, that's ours, our very messy slide.
Hey, Heather.
Sorry, I couldn't get into the right screen because your screen looks really small, so I'm just going to use my screen if you don't mind.
Sure.
I don't see you necessarily. Did you want us to go through 1 and then 2?
Yeah, just a couple key points that were of most interest that you'd want to share.
Well, so it was a really interesting conversation because we had, let's see, sort of Victoria, the UK, and a couple of countries in Africa represented in our room. So, and yet the situations were very similar. So we talked a lot around question 1 about how community was really important, and small scale community was really important. And it caused us sort of the medical health officer told us to, find a pod or create pods, safe pods of people that we would hang out with, and that this created even more community because we had these small pods and we had to interact with each other that way. Mm-hmm. So that was really interesting there. And then when we started talking about actions that we could take to decolonize, a lot of it came to, again, that sort of personal, we have to stand up and do it ourselves. We can't count on somebody else to do it, to make the phone call, to write the letter, to put something on social media. And we need to stand up, as a community, but as individuals in our community. I hope I did a decent job.
That's great. That's perfect. Thanks so much. It's great to have them all captured here too. Thanks, Heather. And let me see if I can scroll. Group 2. Is there anyone from Group 2? I don't see any names.
That was our group with Charmaine and Beth. And we just talked, amongst women. We didn't write, but I took notes. I'll send them to the organizers.
Great. Is there anything you wanted to share about the conversation, or?
So I'm happy to share. We tried to pick just a few points. One of the things that we discussed was a practice that Catherine actually shared about in Africa, where youth were invited to interview members of their community, elders, etc., and uncover oral history and tradition and culture, and present reports back to the community, perhaps even bind them and have them in the local library. But the idea that youth can actually serve as hidden knowledge transmitters. So this is knowledge that is there in the community, but until the youth sort of surfaced it and drew it out, no one was maybe aware. And the other thing we talked about was the importance of, certainly in my world, we've discovered that the importance of providing education and training in community and with community, as opposed to expecting people to travel 500 miles to come to our university campus, has been absolutely critical in disseminating knowledge, in inspiring engagement and increasing confidence locally. So those were two of our many, many points.
Great. Thanks so much, Charmaine. And how about group 3?
Yeah, we had a great discussion, and I was typing away while Patricia, Rachel, and Paul, whose name I didn't put or mine in there because I got lost in the excitement of typing down some ideas of what the conversation was about. So we were Paul and myself were there along with Patricia and Rachel. A really interesting sharing of things which are actually happening. Just for example, we heard from Patricia about an example seeking co-management with Squamish Nation on an initiative on Indigenous knowledge sharing, and that's with SFU, and then sharing that with other biospheres around the world. And also another example that Rachel shared with us about, an example of including Indigenous knowledge in business education at UVic in a program which is developing that now. And I think some of the reflections that we heard were that doing this really takes time and effort. It's going to raise tough questions that will need tough answers sometimes. There's going to be uncertainty as part of this process, and there's going to be a need for patience to work through these processes for shared understanding. They can take time. We also heard, for example, another initiative that Paul mentioned, the Moose Hide campaign about supporting healthy masculinities, and I think that these are just examples that are actually out there. And I would say to everybody, based on some of the ideas that Paul was sharing, the Raven Capital website is a great source of ideas. I've now encouraged people, I'm going to look at that after this this event, and just to see what I can learn from there too. When we talked about actions that we can take, I think there were some really useful thoughts that we shared as well. Example of some reading from Paul, and I think a really good observation that when embarking on these journeys intended to be truly collaborative and learning from particularly Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous communities, that those who are embarking on that journey should really take care not to burden Indigenous communities with the time it takes for them to learn, because that can just be an exhaustion on time and availability of people, given the number of people who are actually recognizing the huge importance and value of Indigenous knowledge and how that can actually contribute to addressing many of the big challenges that we've been addressing in the Victoria Forum. But how we go about that learning process and engagement process, avoiding being patronizing, breaking down some of the framings and challenging ourselves about understanding about the relationships that we're embracing. And Patricia also shared a very nice educational example that she's using with students, helping them learn to be open-minded and collaborative. And it's a process of personal reflection called the 4 Fs, where participants in the process go through a process of reflecting on facts, feelings, findings, and the future. And it's just a really, I think, a lovely framework to use when inviting people to explore alternative possibilities. And we were talking a bit at the end about that. And just as we were cut off, Paul was talking about the importance of ceremony. And I'd love to hear more about that at some point. But that's also part of this experience in imagining a different future. My colleagues and anyone who'd like to chip in as well are welcome to do so.
Thanks so much, Peter. Okay, that was a great summary. So we'll keep moving to group 4. If there's any volunteers from group 4.
I think, hey everyone, my name is Jamila. We actually spent most of our time in question 1, and so we were throwing in things from question 2, so we just did a blend of both. But we were discussing about how sometimes you can feel uncomfortable, for example, if you're in a position of power and you do want to create spaces for people from either like the BIPOC community, for example, how do you bring them to the table? And we really went down into this idea that it's about building empathy. And like Paul mentioned, it's about having that internal change within the people, even in an organization. An example that was brought up is how when it comes to institutions like in universities and academia, there is so much value that is put in titles and in that just institutionalized experience, but that automatically also erases and gives less value to lived experiences that might, for example, represent the cultural knowledge that somebody carries with them and information that can be that is passed down through generations and that is very much informed by systems of governance or observations, experiences. And by erasing those experiences, we are in a way also erasing the identity of the people that might come in. And so we also were discussing how in an organization, a strategy that worked well is transparency. And how even though as a business or as an organization, you can have diversity and inclusion as one of your goals and your strategic, priorities, but if it's not lived by the people in the organization and that if it's not part of the culture itself that you're building, just having it written in paper won't make a difference. And that ties into how we see these very big companies too, or a small one, doesn't matter. We stand with the LGBTQ community, we support this. But again, we have to ask ourselves what is happening internally. There's things that we didn't write down. I'll email you, Crystal. But, when it comes to transparency for anybody who's looking for frameworks, I've seen a lot of the B Corp framework that really pushes that transparency, anybody who's in business. Also, when you look at the UN Sustainable Development Goals and you're interested in seeing what can you do, those are frameworks that are well established and acknowledged throughout the world. And then finally, I think is, I added one at the end, but something that I did that has worked really well with my team. I have a team that's very diverse and we have Indigenous people, mostly women. And I'm a co-founder of a company, but really is bringing our team as part of training to not just learn like what is colonization, how do we decolonize, is taking away the analytical view into all of these processes and really approaching it from a heart and human-centered perspective. And so sitting in and listening to stories, sitting in and inviting people from our communities to speak and to share, and giving power to people within the team that might not be just the CEO or the co-founder to actually bring forward what training do we need as a whole community. And by using things like this, so Jamboard, if you have a team, you can just ask questions about what do you not understand? What do you want to get help in? And I work in the area of biotechnology and sciences, so I end up working with a lot of white men. And the questions I've had are things like, how do I become an ally? How do I work? How do I create safer spaces for women? And so when you shift that power dynamic and you give power to people in your team to lead, even where the company is heading or your organization, that's, I believe, one of the steps we are taking very well about decolonizing even and reframing that narrative of who has power and who doesn't.
Thank you so much, Jamila. I have to acknowledge Jamila, who's also part of our critical advisors team. Peter and I have been working with for these last, 10 months together. And I did see Joanne on here also. So just a shout out to you both for helping us frame this session, but also our session yesterday on youth and the future of work and citizenship. So thank you so much, Jamila. It was a really thoughtful overview, and definitely email me more. And we'll go to the next slide. This was my group. Naman or Mark, are you feeling inspired to share some of the ideas that we spoke about?
Go ahead, Crystal. I think you'll do a great job.
I was trying to get out of that one, but so we had a really great conversation. Speaking about just being together, I think, this idea of creating more spaces to learn from each other, to appreciate our differences. How do we bring those, take those divides away? Especially during these times where we're so isolated. Naman was saying, I just want to go and knock on my neighbors' doors and say hi. And, as simple as that, as being part of the community and knowing your neighbors, knowing people around you, which brings compassion and a value for our differences. Mark spoke a little bit about just being uncomfortable. We spoke to some of Paul's challenges early on when he spoke to what are we willing to give up for our privilege? What are we willing to be uncomfortable with in that transformation, that it really is this personal inside job, and holding the institutions we work for to account, and to, building on those really good frameworks that, Paul also spoke to, the TRC, UN DRIP, MMIW. I mean, a lot of work has already gone into laying a really good foundation that we can build from. So to not continue to burden communities in that education process, but to really, build from that and challenge ourselves. So I hope I summed up that. We spoke about more, but those are some of the ideas. So I thank my group, and I thank all of you so much for all of these ideas and thoughts. And we are partnered with the Senate, which is, I think, really exciting, because we are able to take these conversations, and Peter and I will be thinking over the next week about how to present this in a succinct way. But certainly this has been really inspiring to hear and to have these smaller engagements. So I do hope you appreciate the smaller breakout session. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and so we can all see each other. We do have a little bit of time left, about 7 minutes. Peter, what are your thoughts? Should we maybe have some open conversations, or I don't know if we've had any, invited any particular questions for any of our speakers, or what are your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, Crystal, and thanks so much for facilitating that conversation as well, and for setting us up with using the Jamboards. Really, really good. Something else I've learned through this experience. I would certainly love to hear just some final thoughts, certainly from our speakers who inspired us at the beginning, from Catherine, Marta, and from Paul, just on what each of you take away from this conversation. Because I think, if you don't mind me coming back to you, I think, you gave us some thoughts to really reflect on, and then in the groups we had that opportunity to sort of bring that to a more personal level. One of our missions, if you like, as Crystal's just said, is to see, well, what would we take from this and bring that into the wider Victoria Forum conversation in terms of potential ways to take this forward, actions, possibilities. And I think I would just really just invite you perhaps just to come back and just share some final takeaways to bring us towards the end of the session. Catherine, maybe I could come to you. What do you take away from this?
Thanks, Peter, that we should do it again. And secondly, take the concept of Ubuntu, U-B-U-N-T-U, coming out of Africa, particularly Southern Africa. I am nothing without you. When we engage with African worldviews, we can learn all of this. When you engage in Canada with Indigenous knowledge, you can learn these new things. And the concept of Ubuntu needs to be woven into our understanding of what leadership is, for example. Leadership, as it's taught, traditionally in business schools, does not capture all the human dimensions of what leadership is. So one thing is just that we need multiple sources of knowledge to be truly human and decolonize knowledge, and to unpack a lot of the concepts that we've learned in colonial institutions. And in our group, last thing, we also said the need to sometimes go out of the school, go out of the university, out of the colonial spaces, to do things in the community and to bridge across institutions and organizations in the community. Thanks, everybody. It's been great.
Thank you, Catherine, so much. Marta, let me turn to you.
So my key takeaway is that there are multiple knowledge systems, and there's no universality ways of knowing. So it's important to regard indigenous knowledge systems, local knowledge systems, as worthy of value, of attention, of input, even informal policy-making processes. In our group, I think we were talking about the knee-jerk reactions of policymakers in the times of COVID without necessarily considering the human factor. So a citizen-centered approach is part of the strategy of decolonizing knowledge, because I think policymakers thought that they were the knowers and they knew what the citizens wanted. So at some point in time, they found themselves with citizens who were saying, I'd rather die of COVID than die of hunger, because the socioeconomic dimension of the pandemic had not been considered. So most people were disobeying social distancing rules and things like that because of the imposition of the policies from above. And then I think also maybe my key takeaway is that platforms for reflection and conversations are very important, because it is such platforms like this that we can learn and unlearn and relearn. And I think, like Catherine, I think we should continue doing this. We should actually continue having reflective spaces, doing this more often. Thirdly, I think it's also important to interrogate our privilege. And just beyond interrogating our privilege, see how we can use our privileged spaces and positions to influence change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marta. Paul.
Thanks again to everyone. So I shifted over the course of this session. I found myself living here leading up to the session, and I started to gain an appreciation of the knowledge that we have that lives here, and then I started feeling the knowledge that we have that lives in our bellies, and the incredible ancestral knowledge that we all carry And I experienced a connection, and I want to invoke that, the ability that we have as a very diverse group of people in this virtual room to experience connection and belonging with each other on this shared journey, and that we can harmonize those different kinds of knowledges. Again, I want to echo Martha and Catherine's call that more of this engagement, and I'm certainly understanding the more, I think, including in discussions with Dr. Tremblay, the value proposition of doing this. And I think the best advice for me came from Patricia, who was in our small breakout group, which is patience. This is a bumpy road, as everybody has said, and we're stressed and we're stretched. And it's easy for this journey to take a backseat when you're stressed and stretched. So the medicine for that ailment is patience and an awareness that the status quo is unacceptable for us, and that we can connect as spiritual, mental, and emotional human beings, even when we can't connect physically in the COVID world. So I'm grateful for that connection, and I wanted to raise my hands in gratitude and respect to everybody here again.
Thank you so much, Paul. And I'll just also acknowledge all the participants who were part of this conversation today. I just note, Sean, thank you for just putting your comment in there about urgency. We're in a world where things may not be seen as moving in a very positive direction. This conversation we're having, many others are also having similar conversations. Many other people are not part of this conversation at all. It would be quite alien to them. How do we embrace the reality that this brings so much, but we need to act soon in order to demonstrate why this will actually make a difference in the wider world, to address some of the biggest challenges that we face in the world. I think that's part of the next conversation. Perhaps, Crystal, that's something that we take into the conclusions for the Victoria Forum, that not only have we learned in exchange today, but perhaps there's a sense of urgency that action is really needed soon. And how can we find ways to do that through these kinds of conversations? And I'm delighted, Paul, to hear you say that this has the experience today has led you to move out of that, perhaps the kind of earlier up here part of the engagement, which I must say I'm also feeling, but I'm left with a sense of collectiveness and collaboration and new relationships in this group. So thank you all so much. I will try again, Paul, to say Nyanspe Hunzu. And thank you all so much. And we will continue this conversation. Thank you for our speakers. Thank you to the participants. Crystal, many thanks as well. And I look forward to continuing.
Nyanspe Hunzu.